Welcome to the Ryerson Negotiation Project. Our guest today is Michael Rapeth, President and CEO of Clark Incorporated. Prior to assuming the role of CEO, Michael served as Managing Director of GeoSem Capital Incorporated. Michael has also practiced law at one of Canada's premier law firms with a focus on mergers and acquisitions. Previous to that, he acted as interim chief financial officer of Holloway Lodging Corporation and acted as CEO of Royal Host, Inc. Michael was the treasurer of the Museum of Contemporary Canadian Art and served on the Young Advisory Board for 2 years. Michael has extensive board experience. He's acted as a director of 5 publicly traded companies in the last 5 years. Currently, Michael is director of Clark and chairman of Holloway. Michael is a graduate of McGill University with a Bachelor of Civil Law as well as Common Law. Welcome to our program, Michael.
Thank you for having me, David.
So tell us a little bit in terms of what you do at Clark. I think I said Clark Tire.
Yes.
I think it's Clark, not Tire.
Yes. So Clark is an investment company that focuses on acquiring controlling positions in distressed or troubled companies and then works to turn them around, sometimes with the management team, sometimes replacing the management team, and then once turned around tries to use them as a platform to grow them and to add on different pieces within an industry or a complementary industry and eventually sell the business generally about a decade later.
Are most of these companies publicly traded companies, or are they privately held?
Most of them would be publicly traded companies. In some cases, there are some privately owned companies.
So there would be a fair degree of negotiations which would be going on between yourselves and the targeted company. Am I right to assume that?
Yes. Sometimes we engage in what would be known as hostile actions towards the company. So we try and buy up stock and take control of the company's board. And sometimes it's negotiated. More often it's the former. But once you have that controlling position, now you walk into a hornet's nest of a board where you do have to negotiate your presence there generally.
So what has been the norm in terms of your experience at Clark? Are most of these targets hostile takeovers, or are they ones where your participation and your investment is welcome?
Most of them would be hostile.
Most of them?
Where we are not welcome initially. But I think if you asked most of the people involved in the companies, whether at the board level or at the management level, 3, 4, 5 years later, I think they would all say that our participation was welcomed in hindsight.
As you prepare for your negotiations with these companies, whether they be a distressed company as such and a hostile takeover, what are some of the things that you do to prepare yourself for those kinds of negotiations?
Sure. So whether it's negotiating with a board, whether it's negotiating with a customer at one of the companies, or a mutually agreeable transaction with a bolt-on acquisition, I always try to do 2 things. The first thing is know your facts inside and out. So whatever you're trying to negotiate, make sure you have all of the supporting arguments lined up for that negotiation. Make sure you know your facts as well as they know your facts, if not better. And then the second thing I try to do is I try to anticipate the arguments that are going to come back at me as to why we shouldn't do something, or as to why the price isn't fair, or as to why this shouldn't happen by X date, or whatever the situation. And then once I anticipate those questions or arguments, line up all the facts to argue against that. And so any question, any situation that comes up, I'm well prepared for.
So tell us about gathering the facts. I would think that our viewing audience may say, well, okay, you know, he looks at a few documents, but what sort of drilling down, due diligence, review that you would have to do on a company and the various facts that are associated with it? If you could just elaborate on that.
Sure. So I happen to be a very data-driven person. the numbers over a longer period of time do not lie, and they tell stories. And so what I try to do is gather up as much financial information or data that I can on a particular situation, and then be able to present that argument not only story-wise or qualitatively, not only hyperbole or emotionally, but say what I'm saying bears itself out in facts. And so if I'm going into a collective bargaining negotiation, I try to capture the historical perspective of the employees or of the hotel, frankly both, and line up, okay, this is how the hotel has performed over an extended period of time. And this is also how the union has performed over an extended period of time, ideally the same time period, and you can show the changing fortunes of both. And so when you go in and say, look, the hotel has not made any money over the last 10 years, but wages or benefits or payroll burden or what have you has increased by this much, then it paints a picture. And when you can drill down and say the source of this increased performance of union, let's say, has been concentrated in this area, benefits perhaps, then at least you can establish a target to go after. And similarly, if you go to the hotel and you say, the reason why the hotel hasn't been performing well is because of labor costs or utilities or taxes or whatever, then you can make your case much more clearly. So dive down into the data as much as possible.
What's the time factor in that?
If you have good systems at your company, not long at all. It could be a day, a couple of days. If you don't have good systems, or if the company has not been measuring a particular data point, then it could take much longer, a couple of weeks.
So your subject matter expertise of the facts becomes a pivotal advantage for you and presumably a disadvantage for the other side.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. Tell us about relationships. Where does that fit in as you prepare to negotiate a merger, an acquisition, a hostile one, a friendly one? Where does relationships come in?
So relationships can be a double-edged sword. The Canadian business world is a relatively small world, and as you get within an industry, it gets even smaller. And so on the negative side, you have probably established relationships with a number of individuals who you now have to negotiate against. And these are nice people, and you want them to win, you want them to achieve their objectives, but sometimes those objectives are at odds with your objectives. And so you really have to manage that. You kind of have to park it and say, okay, that's the personal relationship I've developed with someone over time, but this is business, and I'm going to try to help them achieve their aims, but not without me losing out at achieving my aims. But the other side of that is that if you have built a relationship with someone over a long period of time, particularly a professional relationship, then you can use that to your advantage. Hopefully over that period of time you've been honest, you've done what you've said you're going to do, you've built your company or built what you're working on with this other person in a respectable way. And so if that's the case, they'll be more likely to trust you. And they'll be more likely to accept that you're going to do X if they give you Y.
So I'm going to flip from relationships and I'm going to go to another issue, concessions. As you prepare, do you think about concessions you may have to make or are likely to make, or do you sit back, go with your case, see what the other side says, and then think about giving concessions?
Sure. So you're likely to always have to give something up in exchange for getting something you want, unless you just have so much leverage in the situation and you can take advantage of that. So when I go into negotiation, I always try to outline my priorities. These are the 2 or 3 or 4 key things that I want, and I want these at the expense of other things. And then I have another series of priorities, less important subjects, which I'm happy to get. I don't need to get them. They would certainly help me if I did, but they're not critical. And I can concede on the non-super priority items, but I can't concede on the super priority items. I can concede on all the lesser priority items. it's very important to realize in a negotiation that not only must everyone take something away that benefits them, otherwise your relationship just suffers in the long term, but a huge amount of negotiating is not rational. It's pandering to someone's emotions, and they have to come away feeling like they've won as well. And so you have to be able to make any negotiation ultimately a win-win situation, or at least the perception of a win-win situation. And so you have to be able to give people either substantive gives or perceived gives. And so I always like to have those available to myself as well.
Let's come back now to relationships again.
Sure.
What are some of the values that you, as a CEO, take to the table in terms of a relationship? You referenced earlier, it's important to be honest, but what other values do you take to the table as you negotiate with another party?
I think it's hugely important to go into a situation recognizing that as calm and cool and collected you may be, and as much of the data you have to support your argument, at the end of the day, underlying what you're negotiating are people. Almost invariably, it's people, or it will affect people. And so you really have to keep that in mind and bring your negotiation back to how it affects them, ideally in a positive way. And what I try to do is bring values of honesty, integrity, credibility to the table. I want to be reasonable. I want to be fair. And I want to be blunt. So I want to come out and say, look, this particular negotiation in this respect is not going to help you in the short term, but it will help you in the long term. And a perfect example of that is one of the investments that we have at Clark is a hotel company called Holloway Lodging. And we have a number of hotels, and we have a variety of unions at those hotels. And we went into one union negotiation about 2 years ago, and we were very honest. We said, look, the performance of the hotel has declined over time. And the key reason why it's declined over time is that the product has gotten tired. And so consumers look at the pictures online, look at the reviews online, and they are less likely to stay at the hotel, or they're less likely to pay up for staying at the hotel. And so we need to allocate a significant amount of capital to improving the product. And this was a very large hotel, and the capital commitment was between $10 and $15 million. And so we went to the union and we said, we need you to give certain things up over the next number of years to allow us to make these investments. And if you can't give these things up, then we won't have all the capital that we need to make these investments, and the situation will only get worse. The product will get more tired, and employee wages will suffer over the long term, and employee benefits will suffer over the long term. And so we made our case. Now, had I not followed through with that commitment to upgrade the hotel, I would have lost all my leverage and all my credibility in future negotiations. But we didn't not follow through. We got the concessions that were important to us. We immediately set about a plan to upgrade the hotel, and we have done that over the last 2 years. And the financial performance of the hotel is better, and the financial performance of the union and its membership will be better over time as well as a result.
How do you find your frankness? Has it been to your advantage? Some negotiators will say, well, you know, you need a lot of small talk, and you need to socialize, and you need to hold hands, and then you got to come with your proposal. But you seem to be suggesting is that you're pretty specific. You're going into a negotiations, whether it's with a union or another hotel company. You know what you want. You know what you're prepared to give. Has that worked well for you? Would be there anything that you might change about that kind of style?
It's a very good question. I think being blunt takes people aback initially. They're not used to it, and they prefer the touchy-feely approach to doing things. And that's very much the case when you're dealing with customers also. A lot of dealing with customers is likability. They want to help you because you're likable. and because you treat them in a friendly way. So you need a certain amount of small talk, and you need to gear your style to your end user. If I am dealing with a customer, I would like to present them with the facts, but I also want to make myself very likable. If I am dealing with a union, I don't care to be likable. This is the situation, and these are the hard facts. And I think over time and over the course of the negotiation, they come to respect that bluntness, and they come to respect the fact that if we do this, I can tell them what the impact is right now. And if we do that, it's a different outcome. And so you're able to play with the levers much more quickly and much more honestly by being blunt than by being touchy-feely and just having the negotiation drag on.
Tell us a situation where some of your predictions don't come true. Where does that leave you?
Well, it usually leaves you worse off. And hopefully you have not overextended yourself, and so none of those failed predictions become existential threats to your business. But one interesting negotiation that we've had recently is at one of our companies. We have a customer that uses various divisions of the company, but they use them to varying degrees. So they buy a lot of product from one, but not that much product from the other. They could very well increase their buys at the sub-performing company. And they came to us and they said, look, we need price concessions. Industry's tough. We need to improve our margins. Can you help us? And so we were going to take a hit on the division that was selling product in good quantities and at good prices. And we said to them, okay, well, we'll consider it. But please come back to us and tell us how much of this other product that this other division uses, and how much are you buying from us? How much are you buying from other people? How much of the stuff you're buying from other people is transferable to us? And so they came back a few days later and we said, okay, well, this is what we could do. We could lower the price here by 10% because we assume you're going to give us the same amount of volume. But in exchange for doing that, we want you to transfer all of your production in this other division to us at a reasonable price, and we negotiated the price. What we're betting there is that the amount of increased volume they give us on this hand will offset the decreased price on that hand. We could be wrong. They could be bullshitting us. They could be making it up. And so we're going to take a hit here. We know we're going to take a hit here anyways. Can we try to get something positive out of it? Hopefully we do.
But there's a risk here.
Absolutely.
In terms of that style. It can work very well for you, and then if it doesn't work, it could be quite serious in terms of the risk. But you've obviously identified the risk, or the many risks that are associated with your style, but more importantly, the substance of your style. Is that a fair description?
Yes, there's no way to avoid taking risk. No matter what you do today, you're going to take a risk. And so you have to calculate the upside of that risk. You have to calculate the downside. And hopefully you're entering into situations where the upside is much more significant than the downside is.
By the way, is that part of your preparation?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so whenever you have one of those situations, which we call asymmetric, more upside than downside, we would take that. We would take that chance. And over the life of a company, over the year of a company, over the various divisions or products it sells, you hope that that downside does not really negatively affect the company.
So tell us about Michael's communication style, whether it be with other companies, employees, your management team. What's your communication style like as it pertains to negotiations? How would you describe it?
Well, it's very blunt from a communication style perspective. It's very forthright. I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge when we're wrong or when we have a weak argument, but I'm also going to emphasize when the other side has a weak argument and call them on it. And that's something that people aren't used to. I believe very strongly in meeting in person with people. You're able to read them a bit better. You're able to establish that level of trust better. It's especially important if you're dealing with people who aren't from the business world of Toronto, let's say, because when you're on the phone in Toronto, you're always that big bad Toronto person. Well, when you meet with someone in person and you don't show up in a suit and tie, but you show up in jeans and a sweater, which is what they're working in at the factory, and you go to the local coffee shop and you sit around with them and they realize, hey, this guy's not actually a pain in the butt. This guy, yeah, he has a different perspective. He's trying to get something from his perspective, but he's not a bad person. It helps tremendously. The less formal your communication can be, and what I mean by that is in person or on the phone.
But is that becoming more and more difficult to do in this day and age?
There's a tendency to rely on email, and an even worse tendency to now go to text message or other things. You would not believe how many people want to have substantive conversations by text message. I just refuse. And I don't even get a ringer when a text message comes in on my phone, so it could be days before I realize that someone has sent me a text message. I think it's about making the effort to go and visit the person. And don't have them visit you. You go visit them and see them in their native community, in their local community. If you have a division of a business, if you have a hotel, if you have a manufacturing facility, if you have a paper mill, go to that paper mill and go meet with the people and try to understand their concerns and make them want to engage with you. If all you do is send back emails, or even worse, send back letters that are drafted by lawyers or publicists or whatever, the relationship suffers right off the bat because you lose that oh, he's a real person type of feeling.
You seem to be going against the norm because most people are exchanging emails to follow up conversations that they may have had. And as a practitioner, I can see doing a few emails, but I certainly prefer your route of the one-on-one or group with group of having that conversation. But it's becoming more and more difficult. People not readily available. They'd rather send you a long email. I'll have my lawyer fill you in on that particular aspect. So that's kind of refreshing that the one-on-one is still an important aspect.
And the fact that it's not expected, or the fact that it doesn't happen, makes it all the more important to the recipient of that than it would otherwise be.
Now, you're a relatively young man.
Yes.
You've got lots of good experiences, lots of board experiences, and you're a CEO.
Yes.
Mandates. Do you just pull the mandates out of the air, or do you need to discuss that with your colleagues on your board? Is it part of your strategic plan that you would go to? Tell us a little bit about the mandate that you get for pursuing different companies, whether they're in distress or not.
Sure. So in North America, the trend is that management develops the strategy or the mandate and brings that to the board. The board then provides its feedback and questions it and ultimately approves it or doesn't or makes variations to it. And so as a CEO, I am always trying to develop that mandate, and I'm trying to refine it once I have developed it, bring it to the board, lay out the case why it's a good approach, lay out the weaknesses or be prepared to answer for the weaknesses. And then once I have that mandate from the board or that approval, go and run with it. It's very important that whenever you're implementing a strategic plan or a strategic priority, whenever you're negotiating even a smaller contract, be it a collective bargaining agreement, customer contract, that you have buy-in from as many people on your team as possible. Obviously, for a strategic plan, that means the board, and it means your fellow members of management. If you don't have their buy-in, you might as well not try to implement it or be prepared to be hiring new people. Because if they don't support it, then they may not try to undermine it, but it's just that much harder to implement it. And similarly, if I'm going into negotiation to get a customer, I gotta have my production people on side, I've gotta have my purchasing people on side, I've gotta have my sales guys on side. I gotta know that I can step out of this factory and have my on-the-ground team ready to implement the decision should the customer agree or whatnot. And if you don't have that, it's very tough.
So what does the CEO do in terms of assessing the mandate of the other party?
That's a good question. I think it's just about being thoughtful and stepping into their shoes and saying, okay, this is what I would want to see, this is what I need to get out of this, and then can my mandate and their mandate jive? Can our perspectives come together? And hopefully they can. And bring it back to the labor situation, there's many situations where your mandate as a company is to maximize profit, and their mandate as a union or labor force is to maximize wages. And those actually can live in harmony. And you can just tie a portion of labor's wages or labor's benefits to achieving certain financial targets and say, okay, we're in this together. If you take a haircut on
No jokes about hair, no.
If you take a haircut on your wage, or if you don't get that increase that you've desired, but we achieve this and that, then we'll give you bonuses or one-time payouts or variable pay. And that can harmonize the situation. So it's about trying to bring those perspectives together and thinking out of the box.
Tell us a little bit about the media, particularly in a high-profile case. In researching your activities, I've noticed that, for instance, you made a run at a mining company which was publicly traded, and there was all sorts of circulations being done both on your company as well as others. Tell us about that in terms of the style of your company, and you in particular, as to how best to deal with the media.
It's an incredibly difficult thing to do.
That's why I'm asking the question.
When we went after that mining company, it was called Sherritt. It was a multi-billion-dollar mining company with nickel projects and oil projects and cobalt projects around the world. And we were the activist. We were coming in from the outside. It was a company that had its roots in Canada, 60, 70 years old. And so we were perceived as wanting to completely overthrow the establishment. And that was kind of an accurate way of putting it, but we felt that the establishment was old and gray and needed to be given the boot. There was no way we were going to win the media over there. No amount of facts could have helped us. The media likes sound bites. The media likes a catchy story. And we're driven by numbers and we're driven by details and data. And to convert that into a soundbite is often very difficult because we need arguments that take minutes or longer to make. And when people hear us out, they say, oh yeah, that makes sense, but you need to tell the story. I think the media can do a better job of reporting the facts and getting beyond the soundbite. The best that we can do is try to distill our argument into a soundbite and try not to be perceived as an aggressor. It's very difficult. It's very difficult if you're management and you're in a labor situation. It's very difficult if you're the hostile acquirer and they're the takeover target. It's very difficult to bring them on side. One strategy could be moving with editorials or buying media time or whatever, but in terms of getting them on side, it's very difficult.